The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the vast Arizona desert as Xavier Thorne squinted into the distance, spotting an unusual shape wavering in the heat haze. It wasn't the first time the desert had played tricks on his eyes during his 5 years of roaming the frontier, but something about this mirage seemed different, more substantial than the phantom lakes and illusory oases that typically haunted these barren lands. Xavier pulled on the reins of his chestnut stallion, Rusty, and adjusted his worn leather hat to better shield his eyes from the glare. The year was 1878, and the unforgiving terrain between Tucson and the small settlement of Sonora had claimed many lives, seasoned travelers and desperate pioneers alike. At 32, Xavier had seen enough death to last several lifetimes. "What do you reckon, boy?" He murmured to his horse, who nickered softly in response. "Let's take a closer look." As he urged Rusty forward, the shape began to take form: a small, covered wagon, partially collapsed, its canvas torn and flapping weakly in the hot breeze, no horse or mule in sight. Xavier's hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip as he approached with caution. Bandits were common in these parts, and ambushes weren't unheard of. The wagon appeared abandoned, its wooden frame scorched by the relentless sun. Xavier dismounted, his boots landing softly on the sand as he approached. The silence was eerie, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the occasional distant cry of a hawk. "Hello," he called out, his voice sounding foreign in the emptiness. "Anyone there?" A faint sound answered him, so quiet he almost missed it. Not the rattle of a snake or the rustle of a desert creature, but something distinctly human. A whimper. Xavier moved around to the back of the wagon, his spurs jingling with each step. The sight that greeted him stole his breath more effectively than any punch to the gut. A young woman lay curled protectively around a bundle in her arms. Her dress was torn and dusty, her dark hair matted with sweat and sand. Her lips were cracked from dehydration, and her eyes, when they fluttered open at his approach, were glazed with fever and fear. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Help my baby." The bundle in her arms moved, and Xavier caught sight of a tiny face, flushed red with heat. The infant couldn't have been more than a few months old. Without hesitation, Xavier knelt beside them, reaching for his canteen. "Madam, I'm going to help you. Can you sit up a bit?" She struggled to rise, and he gently supported her back with one hand. "Small sips," he instructed, holding the canteen to her parched lips. "Too much at once will make you sick." She drank obediently, then pulled back. "The baby," she insisted weakly. Xavier nodded, understanding her priority. "Let me see the little one." She reluctantly loosened her grip on the infant. Xavier carefully dampened his bandana with water and pressed it gently to the baby's lips, allowing tiny amounts of moisture to be absorbed. The child responded with a weak cry that was simultaneously concerning and hopeful. "What's your name, madam?" Xavier asked, continuing to administer water to both mother and child. "Nora," she replied. "Nora Mitchell. This is my daughter, Sarah." Her voice cracked. "My husband, Daniel. We were traveling to Sonora. Apaches attacked 3 days ago. They took the horses. Killed Daniel." Tears cut tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "I've been trying to keep her alive." Xavier nodded grimly. "You've done well, Mrs. Mitchell, real well." He assessed their condition with a practiced eye. They wouldn't survive another day out here. "I'm Xavier Thorne. I'm going to get you both to safety, but we need to move quickly before the sun sets." Fear flickered in Nora's eyes. "I don't think I can." "You won't have to do anything but hold onto your daughter," Xavier assured her. "My horse can carry us all to Sonora. It's about 4 hours' ride from here." He helped her to her feet, but her legs buckled immediately. Without comment, Xavier scooped her into his arms, baby and all, and carried them to where Rusty waited patiently. The horse snorted in mild protest at the prospect of the additional weight. "I know, boy," Xavier murmured, "but we don't have a choice." He settled Nora and the baby on the saddle first, then mounted behind them, one arm securely around Nora's waist to keep her from falling. The woman leaned back against his chest, too weak to remain upright on her own. "Thank you," she whispered as they began to move. "Why would you help strangers?" Xavier's answer was simple. "Because out here nobody survives alone." As they rode, Xavier kept a vigilant eye on their surroundings. The desert was beautiful but deadly, especially to those who didn't respect its power. The woman in his arms was burning with fever, and the baby whimpered intermittently. He urged Rusty to maintain a steady pace, knowing that stopping wasn't an option. "Stay with me, Mrs. Mitchell," he said whenever he felt her consciousness slipping. "Tell me about your daughter." "Sarah," Nora murmured, "named after my mother. She's 4 months old." Her voice drifted. "She has her father's eyes." Xavier continued prompting her to talk, knowing that keeping her awake was crucial. He learned that Nora and Daniel had married 2 years ago in St. Louis, that Daniel had heard tales of silver in the Arizona territory, and that they had sold everything they owned for a chance at a new beginning. "Daniel was going to build us a home," she said, her voice thick with grief. "He had plans drawn up and everything." The sun was beginning its descent when Nora fell silent, her body growing heavier against Xavier's chest. The baby had stopped crying, which worried him more than if she'd been wailing. "Mrs. Mitchell," he jostled her gently. "Nora, stay awake now." When she didn't respond, Xavier made a decision. They were still at least 2 hours from Sonora, but there was a small homestead belonging to an old acquaintance that should be less than an hour away. He altered their course slightly, heading northeast. "Hold on," he urged the unconscious woman and her silent child. "Just hold on." The Jackson homestead appeared on the horizon just as the sun touched the mountains in the west. It was a modest affair, a sturdy cabin with a small barn and corral, a vegetable garden protected by a fence of wire and wood. Smoke rose from the chimney, a welcome sight that meant someone was home. Xavier rode directly to the cabin door and called out, "Martha, it's Xavier Thorne. I've got an emergency." The door swung open to reveal a sturdy woman in her 50s, her gray streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her eyes widened at the sight of Xavier with an unconscious woman and baby. "Lord above," she exclaimed, "bring them in immediately." Martha Jackson was a former Army nurse who had followed her husband west after the war. Though widowed for 5 years, she had maintained their homestead with remarkable efficiency. More importantly, she had medical knowledge that far surpassed anyone else in the territory. Xavier carried Nora and Sarah inside, laying them gently on Martha's bed as instructed. "What happened?" Martha demanded, already gathering supplies, found them abandoned in the desert. "Husband killed by Apaches, according to the woman. Name's Nora Mitchell, baby is Sarah. They've been out there at least 3 days, maybe more." Xavier stepped back, watching as Martha examined them with practiced hands. "The baby's dehydrated but not critically," Martha announced after a thorough assessment. "The mother is worse off severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, and I suspect the beginning of infection in that cut on her arm." She looked up at Xavier. "Did you give them water?" "Some, but carefully." "Was afraid of making them sick." Martha nodded approvingly. "You did right. Now make yourself useful and fetch more water from the well. I'll need plenty to cool them down and get fluids into them." For the next several hours, Xavier assisted Martha as she worked to save the mother and child. They took turns spooning small amounts of water into Nora's mouth, bathed her with cool cloths to bring down her fever, and fed the baby a thin mixture of goat's milk and water using a clean cloth for the infant to suckle. Night fell, and still they worked. Xavier stepped outside briefly to tend to Rusty and breathe in the cooler night air. The stars were brilliant above him, a vast tapestry that always reminded him of his insignificance in the grand scheme of things. Yet tonight, he felt strangely significant. His decision to investigate that wagon had meant life instead of death for 2 souls. When he returned inside, Martha was sitting in a rocking chair, cradling the baby who now slept peacefully. "She took some milk," Martha said quietly. "Good appetite for one so small." "She's stronger than she looks." And the mother, Martha's expression grew more serious. "The fever's holding steady, not rising but not breaking either. The next 12 hours will tell. You should get some rest, Xavier." He shook his head. "I'll sit with her for a while." "You've been on your feet all evening." Martha didn't argue, carefully transferring the sleeping infant to a makeshift crib she'd fashioned from a wooden drawer padded with soft blankets. "Call me if anything changes." Xavier took the chair beside Nora's bed, studying her face in the soft lamplight. With the grime of the desert washed away, he could see she was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 23 or 24. Her features were delicate, with a small, straight nose and full lips that were still pale despite Martha's efforts to restore moisture. Her dark hair spread across the pillow, revealing strands of deep auburn when caught by the light. He dipped a cloth in cool water and gently placed it on her forehead, noting the slight furrow between her brows even in unconsciousness. What kind of life had she led before embarking on this ill-fated journey? What dreams had she and her husband shared about their future in the West? And now, what would become of her and the baby if they survived? Xavier wasn't a man who formed attachments easily. Years of drifting had taught him that connections meant pain when inevitably severed, but watching this young mother fight for life, having already lost so much, stirred something in him he thought long buried. "You're going to be all right, Nora Mitchell," he said softly. "You and your daughter both." To his surprise, her eyelids fluttered open. Her gaze was unfocused at first, then gradually cleared as she became aware of her surroundings. "Where?" she whispered. "Safe," Xavier assured her. "You're at the homestead of Martha Jackson, about an hour's ride from Sonora. Martha's tending to you and your baby." Sarah, panic flashed in her eyes as she tried to sit up. Xavier gently pressed her back down. "She's right over there, sleeping soundly. She's taken some milk and is doing better." Relief washed over Nora's face. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how to repay you." "No need for that," Xavier replied. "Anyone would have done the same." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "No, they wouldn't, not everyone." Her words trailed off as exhaustion reclaimed her, her eyes drifting closed. Xavier continued his vigil through the night, occasionally relieved by Martha, who checked on her patients with professional efficiency. By dawn, Nora's fever had broken, and she was able to take more water and a few spoonfuls of Martha's bone broth. The baby woke hungry and vocal, a marked improvement from her lethargic state the previous day. Martha showed Nora, still weak but determined, how to feed Sarah with the cloth dipped in the diluted milk. "She needs her mother's milk," Martha told Nora. "You'll need to regain your strength quickly for her sake." "I will," Nora promised, her voice stronger than it had been. Her eyes sought Xavier, who stood near the door. "Mr. Thorne, I don't know how to thank you." "Xavier," he corrected, "and like I said, no thanks needed." "Where are you headed?" Martha asked him. Knowing his nomadic ways, Xavier hesitated. His original plan had been to deliver supplies to a mining camp near the border, then possibly continue into Mexico, where he occasionally found work as a guide. But the thought of leaving Nora and Sarah before knowing they would be truly safe didn't sit well with him. "No rush," he said finally. "Thought I might stick around Sonora for a spell." Martha gave him a knowing look but made no comment. For the next 3 days, Nora and Sarah recovered under Martha's expert care. Xavier made himself useful around the homestead, repairing a sagging section of fence, chopping firewood, and hunting fresh meat to supplement Martha's stores. Each day, Nora grew stronger, and each evening, Xavier found himself spending more time in conversation with her as Sarah slept nearby. He learned that Nora had been a schoolteacher in St. Louis before marrying Daniel, who'd worked as a carpenter. They had delayed starting a family until Daniel's business was established, and Sarah's arrival had been the fulfillment of their greatest wish. The decision to head west had been difficult, but prompted by increasing competition in St. Louis and stories of opportunity in the territories. "Daniel said we could have a better life," Nora said softly on the 3rd evening, "that Sarah could grow up with open skies instead of city smoke." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. He was so sure. Xavier nodded, understanding the cruel irony of dreams cut short. The West offers much, but it takes much too. Your husband's vision wasn't wrong, just incomplete. He couldn't have known. And now what? Nora asked, her voice small but steady. "I have no home, no money, no husband, just a baby depending on me." "You have options," Xavier replied. "Sonora's a growing town. They need teachers. And there's Martha. She's mentioned more than once that this place is too big for one woman." Nora considered this. I wouldn't want to impose nonsense, Martha interrupted, having entered with a fresh pot of tea. I've been thinking the same thing myself. This house has been too quiet since George passed. Having you and the little one here would be a blessing, not a burden. The relief on Nora's face was evident, but Xavier could see she was still processing her grief and shock. You don't have to decide anything tonight, he assured her, or tomorrow. Take the time you need. On the morning of the fourth day, Xavier prepared to ride into Sonora. I'll speak to Sheriff Hayes about what happened, he told Nora, and I'll arrange for proper burial for your husband if you'd like. Nora nodded gratefully. Daniel deserves a proper resting place. I have this. She handed Xavier a small gold pocket watch. It was his father's. It should cover any expenses. Xavier closed her fingers back around the watch. Keep it for Sarah. I'll take care of the arrangements. He rode out with the rising sun at his back, his thoughts unusually occupied for a man accustomed to solitude. The small town of Sonora came into view by mid-morning, a collection of wooden buildings straddling the main road, with scattered homes and businesses spreading outward like tentative fingers. It wasn't large, but it was growing steadily as the railroad pushed ever closer. Sheriff Hayes was a practical man who had known Xavier for several years. He listened to the account of finding Nora and Sarah, making notes in his ledger. Third Apache attack this month, he said grimly. Army's supposed to be keeping them on the reservation, but there's always some that break away. He looked up at Xavier. You say the woman's at Martha Jackson's place? Yes, she's recovering well, but she lost everything. The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. Town council was just talking about needing a new teacher come fall. Previous one got married and moved to California. He studied Xavier with shrewd eyes. You planning to stick around, Thorne? Not like you to get involved in other folks' troubles. Xavier shifted uncomfortably under the assessment. Just doing what needed doing, MMM. Hayes didn't look convinced. Well, I'll ride out tomorrow to take Mrs. Mitchell's statement. As for retrieving her husband's body, he shook his head. After 3 days in that heat and with Apaches in the area, it's not advisable. We can place a marker in the cemetery if she'd like. Xavier had expected this response. Desert burials were often symbolic rather than actual in these circumstances. I understand. I'll explain it to her. He spent the rest of the day in town, purchasing supplies with his own money, fabric for new clothing for Nora and Sarah, basic necessities they would need, and additional food stores for Martha, who had generously shared her provisions. At the general store, he encountered Eliza Hammond, the mayor's wife, and mentioned Nora's situation. A teacher, you say? Mrs. Hammond's interest was immediately piqued. And with a baby, the poor dear, you must bring her to town when she's recovered. The council would certainly want to meet her. Word spread quickly in Sonora, and by the time Xavier prepared to return to Martha's, several townspeople had contributed additional items for the young widow and her child: a handmade quilt, baby clothes outgrown by other children, a jar of preserved peaches, and even a small sum of money collected among the church ladies. Folks here have good hearts, the storekeeper commented as he helped Xavier pack the supplies. Just need to know where help's needed. The generosity both surprised and moved Xavier, who had maintained a certain detachment from community life during his years of wandering. He had always preferred the freedom of the trail to the constraints of town living, but he was beginning to see the value in the connections that bound these people together. When he returned to Martha's homestead, the setting sun cast long shadows across the property. He found Nora sitting on the porch, Sarah asleep in her arms, watching the golden light fade from the distant mountains. It's beautiful here, she said as he approached. So different from St. Louis. Daniel would have loved this view. Xavier nodded, unsure how to transition to the news about her husband's burial. He unloaded the supplies first, bringing Martha and Nora up to date on his conversations in town. The teaching position sounds promising, Nora admitted, though I'd need a place to live in town. The school has living quarters attached, Xavier explained. Small but adequate for a teacher and child, or there's Martha's offer, which stands firm, Martha added from the doorway. Later, when Martha had gone to bed and Sarah was settled for the night, Xavier finally broached the difficult subject with Nora as they sat by the fire. Sheriff Hayes says it wouldn't be safe or practical to retrieve Daniel's body, he said gently. But the town would be honored to place a marker for him in the cemetery. Nora was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. I knew, she finally said. I think I've known since you found us. It's just hard to accept that I'll never see him again, never give him a proper goodbye. A tear slipped down her cheek. But a marker would be nice. Somewhere I could take Sarah as she grows to tell her about her father. Xavier hesitated, then reached across to cover her hand with his own, a gesture of comfort that surprised them both. I'm sorry for all of it. Her fingers turned to grip his briefly. You have nothing to be sorry for. You saved our lives. The moment hung between them, charged with something neither was ready to acknowledge. Xavier withdrew his hand first, standing to add another log to the fire. The sheriff will come tomorrow to take your statement, he said, changing the subject. And Mrs. Hammond, the mayor's wife, is eager to meet you regarding the teaching position. Nora nodded, visibly gathering herself. I should be ready by then. Martha says I'm healing well. You're stronger than you know, Xavier observed, both you and Sarah. A small smile touched Nora's lips. We have to be, don't we? There's no other choice. Over the next week, Nora's recovery progressed rapidly. Sheriff Hayes took her statement about the attack, expressing regret for her loss and assuring her that patrols would be increased along the route where it had occurred. Mrs. Hammond and 2 other members of the town council visited, essentially offering Nora the teaching position on the spot after a brief discussion of her qualifications. The school term starts in 6 weeks, Mrs. Hammond explained. That should give you time to fully recover and prepare. The living quarters will need some freshening up, but we can help with that. The practical aspects of rebuilding her life seemed to give Nora renewed purpose. Though her grief remained evident in quiet moments, she began to engage more actively in daily tasks and planning for the future. Xavier, meanwhile, found himself inventing reasons to delay his departure. He repaired Martha's roof, constructed new shelves for her pantry, and reinforced the corral, all tasks that could have been completed in days, but somehow stretched to fill the week. On the 8th day after bringing Nora and Sarah to Martha's, Xavier finally ran out of projects and excuses. I should be moving on, he announced at breakfast. Those supplies still need to reach the mining camp. Martha and Nora both looked up from their plates, but it was Nora who spoke first. When will you leave? Tomorrow, I reckon, at first light. Xavier focused on his coffee, avoiding the emotion he didn't want to see in Nora's eyes or acknowledge in himself. I see, Nora said quietly. We've imposed on your time far too long already. It's not that, Xavier began, then faltered. How could he explain what he didn't understand himself? This pull he felt toward her and Sarah, the reluctance to return to the solitary existence he'd maintained for years. Martha, perceptive as always, rose from the table. I need to check on the garden. Xavier, would you mind bringing in more firewood before you go? Winter will be here before we know it. Left alone with Nora and the sleeping Sarah, Xavier struggled to find words. Nora saved him the trouble. You've done more than enough for us, Xavier, she said. More than anyone could expect. I want you to know how grateful I am, not just for saving our lives, but for your kindness afterward. She paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. I understand that you have your own life, your own path. I would never want to be a burden. You're not, he said quickly. Neither of you. Then why do you look like a man preparing for the gallows when you speak of leaving? Her directness caught him off guard. Xavier ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. Because I don't know what I'm doing anymore, he admitted. For years, I've been just fine on my own. No attachments, no responsibilities beyond myself, and then I found you and Sarah, and suddenly... Suddenly what? Nora prompted when he didn't continue. Suddenly I'm wondering if that life is enough anymore, he finished quietly. And that scares me more than any Apache war party or desert sandstorm. Nora's expression softened. I understand fear, Xavier. I'm terrified every day when I think about raising Sarah alone, about starting over in a strange town with nothing but the charity of others to support us initially. You'll manage, Xavier said with conviction. You're the kind of woman who survives. So are you, Nora replied. But surviving isn't the same as living, is it? The question hung in the air between them, unanswered as Sarah began to stir and fuss. Nora turned her attention to the baby, and the moment for deeper conversation passed. That evening, Xavier packed his few belongings, preparing for an early departure. Martha cornered him in the barn as he checked Rusty's shoes one final time. "You're a fool, Xavier Thorne," she said without preamble. He straightened, raising an eyebrow. "How's that? You think running away will make these feelings disappear? Trust me, they'll follow you." "I watched my George try the same thing before we married, scared himself silly thinking about being responsible for a wife. Rode all the way to California before realizing he was more miserable without me than he was scared of being with me," Xavier sighed. "It's not that simple, Martha, isn't it? You care for that woman and her child. Anyone with eyes can see it, and she cares for you too, though she's still grieving and may not fully realize it herself." Martha's voice softened. "I'm not saying marry the girl tomorrow, I'm saying give this a chance before you disappear into the sunset." "And do what? Settle down in Sonora, become a shopkeeper, a rancher?" Xavier shook his head. "That's not who I am. Who you are is a man who stopped to help a dying woman and baby when others would have ridden past. Who you are is someone who values life and decency in a land that often lacks both." Martha placed a weathered hand on his arm. "The rest, the where and the how, that can be figured out in time." Xavier had no response to that, and Martha left him to his thoughts, which remained tumultuous through the night. When dawn broke, he rose quietly, dressed, and made his way to the barn to saddle Rusty. The early morning was peaceful, with just the first bird songs breaking the silence. He was leading Rusty from the barn when he spotted Nora on the porch, Sarah bundled in her arms against the morning chill. "I thought I'd miss you," she said as he approached. "Wanted to get an early start," Xavier replied, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "I understand." Nora shifted Sarah to one arm and reached into her pocket with her free hand. "I want you to have this." She held out a small, intricately embroidered handkerchief. "It's not much, but I worked on it these past few evenings, something to remember us by." Xavier took the handkerchief, running his thumb over the delicate blue embroidery, his initials, XD, surrounded by a pattern of stars. "It's fine work," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Thank you." "We'll never forget you, Xavier Thorne," Nora said softly. "Sarah may not remember in the conventional sense, but she'll know your name and what you did for us. I'll make sure of that." Xavier nodded, suddenly unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. He tucked the handkerchief carefully into his shirt pocket close to his heart. "Be safe on your travels," Nora continued, "and if you ever pass through Sonora again, I'll look you up," he promised. They stood for a moment in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Then Xavier tipped his hat, turned, and mounted Rusty. As he rode away, he didn't look back, knowing that if he did, his resolve might falter. The trail to the mining camp was familiar, winding through canyons and across stretches of open desert. Xavier traveled mechanically, his body following the route while his mind remained stubbornly fixed on the woman and child he'd left behind. By midday, he'd made good progress, but the sense of wrongness grew with each mile. He made camp early that evening, unable to summon the energy to push further. As he sat by his small fire, he withdrew Nora's handkerchief from his pocket, studying the careful stitching in the firelight. "What am I doing, Rusty?" he asked his horse, who was contentedly grazing nearby. The answer came to him slowly, like the gradual clearing of muddy water. He was running not toward something, but away from the possibility of loss, of failure, of caring too deeply and being hurt again. But in doing so, wasn't he guaranteeing that very emptiness he feared? Xavier slept poorly, his dreams filled with images of Nora and Sarah vanishing into the desert, always just beyond his reach. He woke before dawn, his decision made. The mining camp would have to wait. He had somewhere more important to be. Xavier rode hard, retracing his route with a sense of urgency that hadn't been present the day before. By late afternoon, he spotted Martha's homestead in the distance, and something in his chest loosened at the sight. As he approached, he saw Martha hanging laundry in the yard. She paused, shading her eyes against the sun to watch his approach, a knowing smile spreading across her face. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon," she called as he dismounted. "Where are they?" Xavier asked without preamble. Martha's smile widened. "Nora wanted to see the town. Sheriff Hayes came by this morning and offered to escort them in to look at the school and living quarters." Her expression grew serious. "If you hurry, you might catch them before they head back." Xavier nodded gratefully, taking only enough time to give Rusty a quick drink before mounting again and setting off toward Sonora. The town was bustling with late afternoon activity when he arrived, wagons being loaded with supplies, ranchers conducting business before heading home, children playing in the dusty street. He spotted Sheriff Hayes outside the general store, deep in conversation with the blacksmith. "Hayes," Xavier called, dismounting swiftly. "The widow Mitchell, where is she?" The sheriff looked surprised to see him. "Thought you'd left for the border, Thorne." He gestured down the street. "Mrs. Mitchell's at the schoolhouse with Mrs. Hammond and the baby. Everything all right?" Xavier didn't answer, already striding toward the simple wooden structure at the edge of town. The schoolhouse was modest but well-maintained, with a smaller attached building that presumably contained the teachers' quarters. He hesitated at the door, suddenly uncertain. What exactly was he planning to say? What was he offering? Before he could sort through his tumbling thoughts, the door opened and Nora emerged with Mrs. Hammond, Sarah cradled against her shoulder. Nora stopped abruptly at the sight of him, her eyes widening in surprise. "Xavier." "You forgot something," he said, the words emerging before he could consider them. Nora looked confused. "What did I forget?" Xavier took a deep breath. "Me," he said simply. "You forgot me, or maybe I forgot myself when I tried to leave." Mrs. Hammond, displaying remarkable perception, quietly excused herself. "I'll just check on that broken window in the back," she murmured, slipping past them into the schoolhouse. Alone or as alone as they could be on a town street, Xavier stepped closer to Nora. "I made it about 20 miles before I realized I was being a fool. I don't know exactly what this is between us, and I know it's too soon after your loss to speak of certain things, but I do know I don't want to ride away anymore." Nora studied his face, her expression a complex mixture of surprise, uncertainty, and something warmer. "What are you saying, Xavier?" "I'm saying I'd like to stay in Sonora, see where this might lead if you're willing." He gestured vaguely between them. "No pressure, no expectations, just possibility." "And what would you do here?" she asked practically, though her voice had softened. Xavier smiled slightly. "Sheriff Hayes mentioned needing a deputy, said the town's growing too fast for one lawman. I've handled a gun responsibly all my life, know the territory better than most, and can track when needed." He paused. "It would mean putting down roots, I suppose. That's something I haven't done in a long time." Nora adjusted Sarah in her arms, the baby now awake and regarding Xavier with solemn eyes. "Roots can be good, Xavier. They give you strength when the winds blow." "I'm beginning to see that," he acknowledged. "So what do you say? Would you object to having me around while you settle into your new life here, as a friend to start with, and then, we'll see?" A smile slowly bloomed on Nora's face, the first real, unguarded smile he'd seen from her. "I think I'd like that very much." Xavier's relief was palpable. "Good. That's good." He gestured toward the schoolhouse. "How do you like your new home? It's small but clean." "Mrs. Hammond says the town will provide basic furnishings and there's a good-sized garden plot behind." Nora glanced at the building. "It's a fresh start. That's what we need now." "A fresh start," Xavier echoed, finding he liked the sound of those words. They walked together back toward the center of town, discussing practical matters when Nora would move from Martha's, what supplies she would need, how the teaching position would work with caring for Sarah. It was ordinary conversation, but to Xavier, it felt revolutionary. For the first time in years, he was planning beyond tomorrow, thinking of someone besides himself. Sheriff Hayes raised an eyebrow when Xavier inquired about the deputy position, but he didn't seem surprised. "Figured you might be interested," he said. "Town council approved the funds last month, but I've been waiting for the right man." Job's yours if you want it, starting next week. Pays not much, but there's a room at the back of the jail you can use until you find something more permanent." And so it was settled. Xavier rode back to Martha's with Nora and Sarah, explaining his decision to remain in Sonora. Martha's only response was a satisfied nod, as if she'd known all along how things would unfold. The next few weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Xavier began his duties as deputy, quickly proving his value to the sheriff and the town. Nora and Sarah moved into the teachers' quarters, which the ladies of Sonora had cleaned and furnished with donated items. Martha visited frequently, becoming something of a grandmother figure to Sarah. Xavier found himself spending most of his free time at the schoolhouse, helping Nora prepare for the upcoming term, building shelves for her books, and constructing a sturdy cradle for Sarah, who was quickly outgrowing the makeshift one Martha had provided. Their relationship developed slowly, respectfully. Xavier was conscious of Nora's recent widowhood and made no romantic overtures, content to build a friendship that might someday become something more. For her part, Nora seemed grateful for his restraint, though Xavier occasionally caught her watching him with an expression that suggested her feelings were evolving too. By the time school started in early October, Nora had settled comfortably into her role as Sonora's teacher. The townspeople had embraced her and Sarah, bringing small gifts, offering childcare during school hours, and generally making them feel welcome. Xavier established himself as a competent deputy, fair but firm in his dealings with troublemakers and trusted by the law-abiding citizens. He found, to his surprise, that he enjoyed having a fixed place in the community, being recognized on the street, having regular meals and a bed that was his alone. One crisp October evening, about 2 months after Xavier's return to Sonora, he and Nora sat on the small porch of her quarters after sharing a simple dinner. Sarah was already asleep inside, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. "You've adjusted well to town life," Nora observed. "Better than I expected," Xavier chuckled. "Truth be told, better than I expected too. Turns out sleeping in the same bed every night isn't half bad, and the deputy work suits me. Most days it's just mediating disputes or moving drunks along, but it feels worthwhile." He glanced at her. "How about you? Teaching going well?" Nora nodded. "The children are eager to learn, even the Ramirez boys, who Sheriff Hayes warned me might be difficult." She smiled, looking out at the darkening landscape. "I think Daniel would be pleased knowing Sarah and I landed safely here." It was the first time she'd mentioned her husband without evident pain, and Xavier noted the change. "I'm sure he would be," he agreed. They sat in comfortable silence for a while until Nora spoke again. "Xavier, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." "What's that?" "That day in the desert when you found us. Why did you stop? Most men would have ridden on, assuming we were already dead or too far gone to save." Xavier considered the question seriously. "I've asked myself the same thing. I've passed by stranded travelers before, usually offering water or directions but not getting involved beyond that." He paused, searching for the right words. "Something was different that day. When I saw you holding Sarah, protecting her even when you had nothing left to give. It stirred something in me, made me remember that life out here isn't just about surviving yourself but helping others survive too." Nora reached over and took his hand, a gesture that had become more frequent between them lately. "Whatever the reason, I'm grateful, and not just for the rescue but for everything since. Your friendship has been a light in what could have been unbearable darkness." Xavier turned his hand to clasp hers more firmly. "It's been my privilege," he said simply. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken feelings. Then, with a gentle decisiveness that surprised him, Nora leaned forward and pressed her lips to his a soft, brief kiss that ended almost before it began. "I hope that wasn't too forward," she said, drawing back slightly. "I know it hasn't been very long since Daniel, and some might think it disrespectful to his memory," but Xavier silenced her with another kiss, equally gentle but lingering longer. "Life's too short and too precious out here to waste time worrying about what others might think," he said when they parted. "What matters is what feels right to us. Relief and something warmer shone in Nora's eyes. "This feels right," she whispered, "being here with you, building something new." As autumn deepened into winter, Xavier and Nora's relationship grew steadily stronger. They were discreet out of respect for her relatively recent widowhood, but the townspeople of Sonora were neither blind nor judgmental. Most seemed to approve of the match, seeing it as a natural outcome of their shared experience. Sarah thrived under their combined care, growing from a fragile infant into a robust, curious baby who delighted in Xavier's visits. For his part, Xavier found himself surprisingly comfortable in the role of surrogate father, a position he had never imagined for himself. By Christmas, Xavier had moved from the sparse room behind the jail to a small house near the schoolyard that he purchased with his savings. The house needed work, but it had good bones, as Martha observed during her first visit. "Planning ahead, I see," she remarked, noting the second bedroom that Xavier was carefully refurbishing. "Just want a proper place," he replied, not meeting her knowing gaze. "Tired of living like a drifter." On Christmas Eve, the entire town gathered for a celebration at the church. Snow had fallen the previous day, transforming Sonora into a winter wonderland that belied its desert surroundings. Inside the church, evergreen boughs and candles created a festive atmosphere, and children performed a simple nativity play that Nora had organized. After the festivities, Xavier walked Nora and Sarah home through the quiet, snow-covered streets. Sarah was bundled against the cold, sleeping peacefully in Nora's arms despite the earlier excitement. "I have something for you," Xavier said when they reached her door. "A Christmas gift, though it's perhaps more of a question." Nora looked at him curiously. "What sort of question requires a gift?" Xavier reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box wrapped in brown paper. "Open it first." Inside was a simple gold band set with a modest diamond. Nora's breath caught as she looked from the ring to Xavier's face. "I know it's only been a few months," he said quietly, "and I'd understand if you need more time, but I love you, Nora. I love Sarah too. I want us to be a family officially." Tears gathered in Nora's eyes. "Xavier, you don't have to answer now," he assured her quickly. "I know it's a lot to consider. Daniel hasn't been gone a year yet, and yes," Nora interrupted, "my answer is yes." Xavier stared at her, momentarily speechless. "You're sure? I don't want you to feel rushed, or I'm sure," she said firmly. "Life is too precious and too uncertain to delay happiness when it's offered. Daniel would want me to move forward, to give Sarah a father who loves her." She shifted the sleeping baby slightly. "We've both been given a second chance, Xavier. I don't want to waste it." Xavier felt a surge of joy unlike anything he'd experienced before. Gently, mindful of Sarah between them, he drew Nora into an embrace and kissed her with all the love and promise he felt. They were married on New Year's Day, 1879, in a simple ceremony at the church. The entire town turned out to witness the union, many bringing gifts for the new family. Martha stood proudly as Nora's attendant, holding Sarah during the exchange of vows. Sheriff Hayes served as Xavier's best man, surprising everyone with his unexpectedly emotional toast at the small reception afterward. "To second chances," Hayes said, raising his glass. "And to the best deputy a sheriff could ask for, though I reckon being a husband and father might be the more challenging job." There was laughter and applause as Xavier kissed his bride again, Sarah happily nestled between them. Later that evening, after Martha had taken Sarah for the night, a wedding gift she had insisted upon, Xavier carried Nora across the threshold of his now their home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thorne," he said, setting her gently on her feet in the front room where a fire blazed welcomingly in the hearth. Nora smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "It's perfect," she said, looking around at the simple but comfortable furnishings, the bookshelves Xavier had built, the rocking chair positioned near the warmth of the fire. "Everything is perfect." As they stood together in their new home, Xavier reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them to this moment. 9 months ago, he had been a solitary drifter with no thought beyond his next destination. Now he was a husband, a father, a deputy, a homeowner, a man with roots as deep and meaningful as the ones he had avoided for so long. "What are you thinking?" Nora asked, noting his contemplative expression. "About water," he replied, earning a puzzled look. "About how I gave you the last of mine that day in the desert, never imagining that you'd end up giving me so much more in return." Nora's expression softened with understanding. "Life works in mysterious ways," she said, reaching up to touch his face. "That day I thought I'd lost everything. Instead, I was about to find everything I needed." As spring bloomed across the Arizona territory, bringing wildflowers and renewed life to the desert, the Thorne family settled into a rhythm of contented domesticity that would have been unimaginable to Xavier a year earlier. Nora continued teaching, now with Sarah playing contentedly in a corner of the schoolroom, or sometimes being passed among the older girls who doted on the cheerful baby. Xavier's duties as deputy kept him busy, but rarely took him far from town, allowing him to return home each evening to his family. Their home gradually transformed with their combined efforts, Nora's touch evident in the curtains and cushions that softened the bachelor furnishings, Xavier's skills apparent in the expanding vegetable garden and the new picket fence that enclosed their yard. Martha remained a frequent visitor and beloved honorary grandmother to Sarah, who was now walking with determined, if unsteady, steps. In late April, just as the desert was reaching its brief, spectacular bloom, Nora shared news that completed their happiness. She was expecting their child, due in the fall. Xavier received the news with stunned joy, holding Nora close as the magnitude of this new blessing sank in. "A brother or sister for Sarah," he marveled, his hand gently resting on Nora's still flat stomach. "A child of our own. Sarah is yours too," Nora reminded him softly, "in every way that matters." "Of course she is," Xavier agreed immediately. "But this," he struggled to articulate the complex emotions the pregnancy evoked. "I never thought I'd have a family at all, let alone 2 children." As summer's heat descended on Sonora, Nora's pregnancy progressed smoothly. The town embraced the news with enthusiasm, with many of the same women who had helped Nora after her arrival now offering advice and support for the coming baby. On a sweltering August evening, Xavier returned home to find Nora sitting on the porch, Sarah playing with wooden blocks at her feet. There was an envelope in Nora's hands, and her expression was thoughtful. "Letter came from St. Louis," she said as Xavier settled beside her, pausing to ruffle Sarah's dark curls. "My sister finally tracked me down through the school board registry." Xavier knew that Nora had lost touch with her family after leaving for the West with Daniel. "Good news?" he asked. "Mostly family updates," Nora replied, "but she also sent this." She handed him a newspaper clipping a notice about unclaimed property belonging to Daniel Mitchell, held in trust by his former employer. "Apparently Daniel had savings I didn't know about," Nora explained, "and some family pieces his employer safeguarded when we sold our belongings." Her voice caught slightly, "including my mother's locket that I thought was lost." Xavier squeezed her hand, understanding that even in her new happiness there were moments when grief still touched her. "Do you want to go to St. Louis, claim what's yours?" Nora considered this. "I do want my mother's locket and anything else that might someday mean something to Sarah about her father." She looked at Xavier uncertainly. "Would you mind? It would mean a journey, and with the baby coming." "We could go after harvest," Xavier suggested. "Before winter sets in, but after the worst heat has passed. You'd be about 7 months along, still able to travel comfortably if we take it slow." He smiled at her surprised expression. "What, did you think I wouldn't want to accompany my wife and daughter?" "I thought you might have reservations about returning to civilization," Nora admitted. "You've spoken before about preferring the open territory to cities." Xavier chuckled. "St. Louis isn't exactly the heart of darkness. Besides, I'm curious to see where you and Sarah came from to meet your sister." He pulled her close, his hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of her stomach. "We'll make it a family adventure." They made the journey east in September, traveling by stage and then rail as the network of tracks now stretched much closer to Arizona than when Nora had made the journey west with Daniel. Sarah proved to be an excellent traveler, charming fellow passengers with her sunny disposition and growing vocabulary. St. Louis was a revelation to Xavier, who had not visited a city of its size in many years. The noise, the crowds, the sheer concentration of humanity both fascinated and overwhelmed him. Nora, though initially disoriented by the return to her former home, soon navigated the streets with remembered ease, pointing out landmarks from her previous life. They stayed with Nora's sister Nancy and her husband George, who welcomed them warmly despite the initial awkwardness of meeting Xavier. "I admit I was shocked when I heard you had remarried so soon," Nancy confessed to Nora one evening when they were alone. "But seeing you with Xavier, you shine in a way I don't remember from before. He's good for you, isn't he?" "The best," Nora confirmed, her hand absently caressing her rounded abdomen. "He saved us, Nancy, not just that day in the desert, but every day since in ways he doesn't even realize." Their business in St. Louis was concluded efficiently. Daniel's employer, a kind older gentleman who had been genuinely fond of his employee, handed over the trust with obvious relief that it would reach its intended recipient. Along with a modest sum of money were several family items: the locket Nora had mentioned, a Bible with family records, and a small wooden box containing cufflinks and a pocket watch that had belonged to Daniel's father. "For Sarah when she's older," Nora said, carefully packing these treasures. "So she'll have tangible connections to her heritage." They remained in St. Louis for 2 weeks, allowing Nora time to reconnect with her sister and introduce Sarah to her aunt, uncle, and cousins. Xavier used the opportunity to learn more about Nora's past, visiting her former school, the church where she and Daniel had married, the park where they had spent Sunday afternoons. "Strange to think how differently things might have turned out," he remarked as they walked through that same park on a golden autumn afternoon, Sarah happily collecting fallen leaves ahead of them. "If Daniel had decided against going west, if the Apaches hadn't attacked, if I hadn't happened to pass by that particular stretch of desert on that particular day." Nora squeezed his hand. "I've thought about that too. It's terrifying how fragile our happiness is, how dependent on chance and circumstance." She looked up at him, her eyes solemn. "But it also makes me treasure every moment more intensely, knowing how easily it might never have been." They returned to Sonora in early October, just as the desert heat was finally releasing its grip on the land. Nora, now in her 8th month, was glad to be home, settling back into their house with visible relief. Xavier resumed his duties as deputy, finding he appreciated the slower pace and familiar faces of Sonora more than ever after the bustling anonymity of the city. Their son was born on a clear, cold November night, with Martha and the town doctor in attendance. Xavier paced anxiously outside the bedroom during the lengthy labor, Sarah having been taken to stay with the doctor's wife. When finally he was allowed to enter, the sight of Nora, tired but radiant, holding their newborn son, nearly brought him to his knees. "Come meet your father," Nora whispered to the tiny bundle as Xavier approached. "The man who gave us everything." Xavier took his son with trembling hands, marveling at the perfect smallness of him, the delicate fingers, the tuft of dark hair, the surprisingly strong grip when one finger was offered for him to grasp. "He's perfect," Xavier whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names but hadn't settled on one, wanting to meet their child first. Now, looking down at the serious little face, Nora suggested, "What about Daniel Xavier Thorne, to honor the past and the present?" Xavier's heart swelled with love and gratitude. "Daniel Xavier Thorne," he repeated softly, "a fine name for a fine boy." The following spring found the Thorne family thriving. Sarah, now approaching her 2nd birthday, was a lively, talkative toddler who adored her baby brother. Daniel, or Danny as they'd begun calling him, was growing sturdy and strong, with Xavier's dark eyes and Nora's sweet smile. Xavier had been promoted to full sheriff after Hayes decided to retire, a position that came with increased responsibility but also greater respect in the community. Nora had temporarily suspended her teaching duties after Danny's birth, but planned to return in the fall, with Martha eagerly volunteering to care for the baby during school hours. Their home had expanded too. Xavier had added 2 more rooms the previous summer, anticipating their growing family's needs. The garden now boasted fruit trees beginning to bear, and a small stable housed not only Rusty but also a gentle mare Nora had learned to ride. One evening in May, as they sat on their expanded porch watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson, Sarah playing with her blocks nearby and Danny sleeping in a cradle at Nora's feet, Xavier reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. "What are you thinking about?" Nora asked, noticing his contemplative expression, a question she often posed when she found him lost in thought. "Water," Xavier replied with a smile, echoing his answer from their wedding night. "And hearts?" Nora raised an eyebrow, encouraging him to elaborate. "3 years ago, I was a man who measured his water carefully because it represented survival in this harsh land. I gave you my water that day because it was the decent thing to do, never expecting anything in return." He reached over to take her hand, his thumb caressing her wedding ring. "But you, Nora Thorne, you gave me your heart, and somehow that restored mine, a heart I didn't even realize had gone missing until I found it again with you." Nora's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she leaned over to kiss him gently. "We saved each other," she whispered against his lips. "And that's the greatest gift of all." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Xavier Thorne, once a solitary wanderer, now a husband, father, sheriff, and pillar of the community, surveyed his domain with profound gratitude. The path that had led him here had been neither straight nor easy, marked by hardship, loss, and unexpected turns. But sitting here with his family, in this home they had built together, he knew with absolute certainty that he had found his true destination. The desert that had once seemed so empty and unforgiving now appeared rich with possibility and beauty. And the water he had offered to a desperate mother and child, a simple act of human decency, had returned to him 100-fold in love, purpose, and belonging. Life in the West would always present challenges, harsh seasons, occasional lawlessness, the eternal struggle to coax sustenance from resistant land. But Xavier no longer faced these challenges alone. His family, his town, and the community they had built together provided strength and resilience that no solitary traveler could match. As night fully descended, and the first cool breeze of evening swept across the porch, Xavier gathered his family, Sarah now sleepy against his shoulder, Danny secure in Nora's arms, and led them inside to the warmth and light of their home. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new responsibilities, perhaps new challenges. But tonight, in this moment, their world was complete. The cowboy who had once given his water to a dying mother and child in the desert had received in return the greatest gift possible: a heart restored, a life transformed, and a love that would endure through whatever trials the frontier might yet hold for them.